I'm still standing in the kitchen when I read the message for the third time, thinking maybe I missed something. Maybe there's a word in there that changes what it means. There isn't. My daughter-in-law had typed it at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and by the look of it, she hadn't lost any sleep over it. We used the money for the house. It's gone. Don't expect it back, and don't expect us to feel guilty about it. We're done being made to feel obligated to you. I set my phone face down on the counter. I put the kettle on. I stood there listening to the water heat up, and I thought about the $240,000 I had transferred to my son's account 14 months earlier, the money from selling the house in Orangeville, the house where I had raised him. I want to be honest about something before I go any further. I knew when I gave it to them that I was taking a risk. My daughter, who lives out in Kelowna, had called me the week before the transfer went through and said, "Mum, are you sure about this?" And I had told her I was. I had told her that her brother needed the help, that his wife had her eye on a house in a neighborhood with good schools, that they were expecting their first baby, and I wanted to do something that mattered while I was still around to see it matter. My daughter had gone quiet on the phone. Then she said, "Okay, Mum, I just want you to be careful." I hadn't been careful enough. My husband passed away 6 years ago now. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by June. We had been married 31 years. He was the kind of man who fixed things without being asked and remembered the names of every neighbor we'd ever had, and I have never once stopped missing him. After he died, I sold the house in Orangeville because it was too large and too quiet, and I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Guelph, close enough to my son that I could see my grandchildren when they arrived, close enough to feel like I was still part of something. The apartment was modest. I had money from the sale, just over $300,000 after everything was settled, and I had my pension from 30 years of work as a school board administrator, and I had what my husband had left behind. I was not wealthy, but I was comfortable. I was careful with what I had because I knew it had to last. My son had always struggled a little. Not in any dramatic way. He was just the kind of person who made choices that cost more than he'd planned for. He and his wife had been renting in Mississauga. Good jobs, 2 incomes, but somehow always a little stretched. When they found out they were pregnant, his wife decided she needed a house in a specific area. The kind of area where the houses are well over $1 million. They didn't have enough for a down payment that would make the mortgage manageable. My son called me and explained the situation carefully, the way he always did when he needed something. He was never aggressive about it. He was just thorough. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I went for walks along the Speed River and thought about it. I sat in my apartment and looked at my bank statements and thought about it. I called my own financial advisor, a woman I'd been with for a decade, and she strongly suggested I do not do it. She said it would leave me in a vulnerable position if my own circumstances changed. She said there were other ways to help that didn't involve giving away a significant portion of what I had. I didn't listen. I wanted to be a good mother. I wanted to give my grandchild a yard to grow up in. I wanted to feel, for once, like I was doing something generous and large-hearted with the years I had left. So I transferred the money, and I asked for nothing in writing because asking for paperwork felt like distrust. And I told myself that this was simply what you did for your family. For a while, things were fine. They moved into the house. My daughter-in-law sent me pictures of the nursery. My granddaughter was born in October, pink and furious and perfect, and I drove down and held her in the hospital and cried the way you cry when something new and irreplaceable enters the world. My son hugged me in the hallway and said, "Thank you, Mum. We wouldn't be here without you." I believed him. What changed, I'm still not entirely sure. If I'm being honest with myself, and I have had a lot of time in the past year to be honest with myself, I think it changed gradually, in the way that things do when no one wants to name what's happening. My daughter-in-law had never been particularly warm with me. She was polite in the way that people are polite when they're tolerating something. She had her own mother, very present, very involved, and I sometimes felt like a secondary figure, a name on a card, a woman who showed up at Christmas with gifts that were accepted without much enthusiasm. After the baby, the invitations became more infrequent. When I called, my son always sounded distracted. I started to feel, when I visited, that I was intruding on something, though I couldn't have said what. My daughter-in-law would say things like, "We have a routine now," or "The baby does better when it's just us," and I would nod and smile and drive back to Guelph and sit in my apartment and try not to read too much into it. Then last Christmas, I wasn't invited at all. I found out through my daughter. She had called to wish me Merry Christmas morning and mentioned she'd spoken to her brother, and something in how she said it made me ask directly. "Did they not call you?" she said, and I could hear her trying to decide how much to tell me. "I don't think they're having people over this year," she said carefully. I told her not to worry about it. I spent Christmas Day alone and told myself it was fine. I made a roast chicken and watched an old film and went to bed early. In January, I called my son and asked if everything was all right between us. He said yes. He said they just needed a quiet Christmas, that it wasn't personal, that his wife had been stressed. I asked if I could come for the baby's first birthday in February, and he said he'd check and get back to me. He never got back to me. I stopped asking. The months went by. I saw my granddaughter twice in 8 months, both times briefly, both times with the distinct feeling that the visit had been scheduled to manage me rather than to welcome me. My son was kind in the abstract way that people are kind when they're trying not to have a conversation. He texted on Mother's Day. He called on my birthday and talked for 7 minutes. And through all of it, the money sat there between us like something no one wanted to acknowledge. I had given them $240,000. I had not asked for a single thing in return, and I was being slowly edged out of my own son's life. I would lie awake some nights and run through it. What had I done that was so wrong? Was it that I visited too often in the early months? Was it something I'd said that I couldn't remember saying? I went through every conversation I could recall, and I could not find the thing that explained it. And then I would tell myself that maybe I was being oversensitive, that young families needed space, that I was from a generation that expected too much proximity. But a grandmother who gave nearly $250,000 toward the roof over her grandchild's head, being quietly excluded from that grandchild's first birthday. I'm sorry, there is no generous interpretation of that. The text came in September. The one I've already told you about. My daughter-in-law sent it at 11:47 on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning I had read it perhaps 15 times. We used the money for the house. It's gone. Don't expect it back, and don't expect us to feel guilty about it. We're done being made to feel obligated to you. I want to tell you I cried. I did, briefly, standing at my kitchen counter in the early grey light of a Wednesday morning. I cried because I had loved my son his whole life, and somewhere in all of this I had lost him to a version of himself I didn't recognize. I cried because my granddaughter was now 14 months old and learning to walk, and I was missing it. I cried because I had been so certain when I signed those transfer documents that I was doing the right thing, and then I stopped crying, and I called my lawyer. Her name is Frances, and she has handled my affairs for 20 years, and when I explained the situation she listened without interrupting until I finished. Then she asked me a single question. Do you have any documentation of the transfer? Emails, texts, anything in writing where the amount or the purpose was discussed? I did. I had the wire transfer records. I had text messages from my son from the time of the purchase, including one where he had written, "Mum, the money's landed. We're so grateful. This is a loan we'll never forget." He had used the word loan. I had not thought much about it at the time, but it was there in writing with a date and his number attached. Frances told me what my options were. She was careful and thorough the way she always is. She told me that it would be a process, that it would not be simple, that family financial disputes rarely are, and that I should think carefully about what outcome I actually wanted before proceeding. She said, "Margaret, what are you hoping for here?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, "I want my son to understand what he's allowed to happen." She filed the initial paperwork the following week. My daughter called me the night after my son apparently received the legal notice. She didn't know about the lawyer yet. She just called to tell me that her brother had phoned her very upset, saying I had blindsided him and that I was trying to destroy his family. I told her everything quietly and in order. The exclusions, the birthday that was never acknowledged, the message from his wife at midnight, the word loan in the text, the $240,000. There was a long silence on the line. Then my daughter said, "Mum, I'm so sorry. I should have pushed harder back when you told me you were doing this." I told her it wasn't her fault. It wasn't. I was an adult who made a decision and didn't protect myself adequately, and I have had to sit with that. Part of what's been hard in all of this, the part I think people don't always want to acknowledge, is that I was not just a victim of my son's choices. I also made my own mistakes. I gave money without documentation because I wanted to feel generous rather than transactional. I kept quiet when I should have asked direct questions. I told myself everything was fine because it was easier than accepting it wasn't. I have thought about all of that. But thinking clearly about your own role in something doesn't mean accepting treatment that isn't right. My daughter flew in from Kelowna 2 weeks later. She stayed for 4 days and we went for long walks along the river, and she helped me go through some of your father's things I hadn't been able to touch since the move. On the last evening she was here, we sat at my kitchen table with tea, and she asked me how I really was. I told her the truth. I told her I was sad in the way that grief is sad, not the sharp grief of early loss, but the slower kind that you learn to carry. I missed who my son used to be, or who I thought he was. I missed the idea of a future with my granddaughter growing up knowing her grandmother. I was sad about that. I was allowed to be sad about it, but I was also, somewhere underneath the sadness, okay. I had my apartment and my pension and my friends from years back and my daughter who had never once made me feel like a burden. I had the Speed River in the mornings and a book club I'd joined at the library and a neighbour down the hall named Ruth who brought me soup when I'd had a cold in March and laughed at all the same things. I laughed at all the same things I laughed at. I had a life. It was smaller than I'd imagined it would be at this point, but it was mine. The legal process took several months. I won't go into every detail because some of it is still being finalized. What I can tell you is that my son contacted me directly, without lawyers, about 6 weeks into the process. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I said yes. We sat across from each other at a Tim Hortons near my apartment. His choice, which I thought was somehow very him, and he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the baby. He looked like someone who had spent several weeks reckoning with something uncomfortable. He told me he was sorry. He said he had let things happen that he should have stopped. He said his wife had taken an attitude toward me that he hadn't pushed back on because it was easier not to, and he understood now that staying quiet had been its own kind of choice, and it wasn't one he was proud of. He said he missed me. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Then I told him that I appreciated him saying it. I told him that I loved him and that wouldn't change. But I also told him that sorry was a beginning, not an ending, and that I was going to need to see what things looked like in practice before I could trust the way I'd trusted before. I told him I was no longer willing to be managed from a distance. I told him that his daughter deserved to know her grandmother, and that if he agreed with that, then we needed to build something new and honest, not just slide back into the old arrangement where I smiled and said nothing while being quietly pushed aside. He nodded. He stirred his coffee for a while. Then he said, "Okay, Mum, I hear you. We're still in the early stages of whatever this new version is. He brings my granddaughter to visit once a month. Sometimes it's stiff the way things are when you're relearning how to be around someone. But she knows my face now. She reaches for me when she sees me. Last time she was here, she fell asleep on my shoulder in the armchair by the window, and I sat there for a long time after she'd drifted off, just feeling the weight of her, just breathing. My daughter-in-law and I have not spoken. I don't know if we will. That's a bridge I'm not able to build alone, and right now I have enough to think about. What I know is this. I spent a lot of years putting other people's comfort ahead of my own honesty. I told myself it was kindness. Sometimes it was. But sometimes it was just fear. Fear of being difficult. Fear of being the mother-in-law who causes problems. Fear of being left out if I asked for too much. I was so afraid of seeming like a burden that I made myself smaller and handed over nearly everything I had and still got pushed to the edges. I'm 67 years old. My husband is gone. My savings are diminished. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Guelph, and I walk along the river in the mornings, and I have a book club and a neighbour who brings me soup and a daughter who flies in from the other side of the country when I need her. I am not who I thought I'd be at this age, but I know, more clearly than I ever have, exactly who I am, and I have stopped apologizing for it. I keep thinking about that morning at Tim Hortons, the way my son stirred his coffee without looking up. The way he said, "I hear you, Mum," like someone who had finally decided to stop running from a conversation he'd been avoiding for the better part of 2 years. I don't know exactly what got through to him. Maybe the legal notice, maybe time, maybe somewhere underneath all of it the person I raised was still there, just buried under years of choosing the easier thing. What I've come to understand is that the way things unfolded wasn't random. I gave without protecting myself, and that left a door open. Not because generosity is wrong, it isn't, but because generosity without honesty eventually hollows itself out. I told myself I was being kind by not asking for paperwork, by not pushing back when the visits became less frequent, by not naming what was happening when I could feel it plainly. But that kind of silence isn't really kindness. It's a way of avoiding discomfort, and it costs more in the long run than any difficult conversation ever would have. I know that now in a way I didn't before. There's something I'd been turning over for months. The people who took advantage of what I offered didn't do it because they were simply cruel. They did it because I made it possible, and then I kept making it possible, month after month, visit after visit, by choosing comfort over clarity. That's the part that's hardest to sit with, not the money, the pattern. I was so determined to be a certain kind of mother, undemanding, uncomplaining, grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion came my way, that I stopped asking whether the people I loved were actually being decent to me. My daughter flew in from Kelowna the moment I needed her. She didn't ask whether I deserved help or whether the situation was complicated enough to warrant the trip. She just came. That's the difference between love that's rooted in something real and love that's conditional on what you can provide. I had both kinds in my life, and losing the false version, as much as it hurt, has made the real version easier to see. What I want, if there's anything worth passing on from all of this, is for anyone in a similar place to understand that thinking clearly about your own life is not a luxury reserved for younger people or people with more options. It's something you owe yourself at any age. Frances asked me what outcome I wanted before she filed anything, and that question sat with me for days. Not what I was owed, not what was fair in the abstract. What did I actually want? I had to be honest enough to answer it, and disciplined enough to act on the answer even when it was uncomfortable, and strong enough to keep moving through the months that followed when the process was slow and uncertain and lonely. I'm 67. I walk along the Speed River most mornings. Last week, my granddaughter fell asleep on my shoulder, and I didn't move for a long time afterward because I didn't want to disturb her. That's what I was trying to protect all along. I just had to learn to protect myself first.